Elias Vance stood at the altar, his jaw clenched so tight he could feel the ache in his teeth. He watched the woman walking toward him, a stranger who carried the weight of his family's ruin in her very name. She was nothing like he had imagined, nothing like he had ever hoped for in the dark, lonely nights on his failing ranch. But in 6 months, this same woman, this unwelcome ghost from his past, would save his life, his land, and everything he thought he knew about the fire that had consumed his world. The morning sun cast long, mournful shadows across the small, dusty wooden church as Elias tugged at the unfamiliar stiffness of his collar. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. In the front pew, his uncle, Elias Vance, sat with his arms crossed, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on his nephew like a hawk watching its prey. There was no escape now. The debts Cyrus had so generously covered were too high, the creditors too impatient, and this cold, loveless marriage was the only way, Cyrus had insisted, to keep the Vance ranch from being seized and sold for scrap. Nora Croft moved slowly down the aisle, her simple dark brown dress rustling with each deliberate step. Elias's stomach twisted into a hard, bitter knot as he studied her. She was not a conventionally beautiful woman, her features too strong, her frame sturdy from a life that had clearly not been easy. This wasn't how he had pictured his wedding day. In the foolish, distant dreams of his youth before the fire, he had dreamed of marrying someone soft, someone beautiful, someone who would make other men in the valley envious. Instead, he was being bound by law and God to a stranger whose name was synonymous with his family's shame. She was the daughter of the man the whole territory believed had, in a drunken stupor, started the fire that had killed both himself and Elias's own father. "Breathe, boy," he whispered to himself, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "It's just business, a merger of land and debt, nothing more." But as Nora approached the altar, something unexpected happened. She looked up and met his eyes directly, and instead of the shame or the nervousness he expected to see in the daughter of a supposed criminal, there was something else entirely. Her gaze was steady, intelligent, and almost challenging, as if she could see right through his bitterness to the frightened, grieving boy he still was. "Mr. Vance," she said quietly when she reached his side, her voice carrying a low, resonant strength that surprised him. "Miss Croft," he replied, his own voice barely above a whisper. The preacher, a nervous young man eager to conclude this awkward affair, began his familiar, hollow words, but Elias barely heard them. His mind was spinning with a hot, impotent resentment toward his uncle for arranging this humiliation, toward his dead father for his supposed weakness, and toward this woman standing beside him, this woman who represented everything he had lost. He thought about the other men in town who would snicker behind his back, about the pitying glances from the women, about the endless jokes they would make about him being shackled to the legacy of a drunkard. When the preacher asked if he took Eleonora as his wife, Elias's "I do" came out flat, cold, and dead, the sound of a nail being driven into a coffin. But when Nora spoke her vows, her voice, unlike his, rang clear and confident through the small, silent church. Something in her tone, a note of unwavering and defiant purpose, made him look at her again. Her eyes weren't downcast or apologetic. They blazed with a fierce, intelligent fire he hadn't noticed before. And when she said, "I do," it sounded less like an acceptance of her fate and more like the opening salvo in a war. The thin, gold ring felt heavy and alien on his finger as they walked out of the church together into the harsh sunlight. But what felt even heavier was the chilling realization that he knew absolutely nothing about the woman he had just married. And from the way she held herself, straight-backed and proud, ignoring the whispers from the small scattered crowd, he suspected she was far more than she appeared. He had no idea that her arrival was not an end to his troubles, but the beginning of a dangerous and necessary reckoning. The ride back to the Vance ranch was the longest, most suffocating hour of Elias's life. Nora sat beside him on the wagon seat, her hands folded primly in her lap, saying nothing. But her silence was not meek or submissive. It was a watchful, analytical silence. It felt like the quiet before a storm. They arrived at the ranch, a place that was more a monument to memory and decay than a functioning enterprise. The main house, once a proud and bustling home, now seemed to sag under the weight of its own sad history. The fences leaned like old, tired men, and a chill seemed to emanate from the blackened skeletal ruins of the old barn that stood at the edge of the property, a permanent, ugly scar on the land. It was the place where their fathers had died, a place Elias had forbidden anyone, including himself, from approaching for 5 long years. As he pulled the wagon to a halt, Nora's gaze was immediately drawn to the ruins. He saw her jaw tighten, her hands clench in her lap. "Stay away from there," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "It's unsafe. There's nothing for you there." Her stormy eyes snapped to his, a flash of something, anger, pain, defiance in their depths. She said nothing, but simply climbed down from the wagon, ignoring the hand he hadn't offered, and walked toward the main house. The message was clear. She would not be given orders. That night was a tense, miserable affair. His uncle, Cyrus, who had taken over the running of the ranch after his brother's death and now lived in the main house, hosted a small, grim dinner. He played the part of the benevolent patriarch perfectly, expressing his deep sympathy for Nora's past and his great hope for their shared future. But Elias watched him, and for the first time saw the subtle, predatory gleam in his uncle's eyes as he looked at Nora. He was a wolf, disguised as a shepherd. Nora, for her part, was a perfect model of polite, distant civility. She answered Cyrus's questions with a quiet intelligence, but her eyes were constantly moving, assessing, taking in every detail of the house, of the men, of the unspoken dynamics of power. She was a strategist, and the ranch was her board. After dinner, Elias showed her to her room. It was small, Spartan, and cold. "This was my mother's room," he said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "It's the warmest in the house." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Mr. Vance," she said. "The foreman, Wade McKinley. He has been with your family a long time?" "Since before I was born," Elias replied, his back to her. "He was my father's most trusted man." "I see," was all she said. But the way she said it, the quiet, thoughtful weight she gave the words, planted a small, unwelcome seed of unease in Elias's mind. Over the next week, Nora proved to be a quiet but undeniable force in the house. She was a tireless worker, but her focus was not on the domestic duties Cyrus tried to assign her. She was drawn with an almost magnetic pull to his father's old study. The room had been left largely untouched since the fire, a museum of his father's life, filled with ledgers, maps, and geological surveys. Cyrus had forbidden anyone from disturbing the papers, claiming it was out of respect for his brother's memory. But Nora, with a polite but unyielding insistence, began to organize them. It was there, on the 3rd day, that she found it. The first clue, a discrepancy. In the main ranch ledger, a large shipment of high-grade timber was recorded as sold to the railroad for a paltry sum, but in his father's private journal, a smaller separate entry noted the same sale, but for a price nearly 10 times higher, with a cryptic note beside it: "Final payment for the hidden asset. C knows." That afternoon, she saw the foreman, Wade McKinley, overseeing the loading of a small, unmarked wagon with several of the ranch's prize-winning bulls. When she questioned him, his answer was smooth and practiced. "Just moving them to the north pasture, ma'am. Better grazing." But later that evening, from her window, she saw the same wagon, not on the path to the north pasture, but on the road that led out of the valley, heading east. She knew she had to tell Elias. She found him in the smithy, the only place on the ranch where he seemed to find a semblance of peace, the rhythmic clang of his hammer the only voice he seemed to trust. She laid out her findings, the ledger discrepancy, the lie about the bulls. He listened, his face a mask of stone in the firelight, but his hands, she noticed, had stilled. She expected him to be angry, to defend the man his father had trusted. Instead, he looked at her with a new and deeply unsettling expression. It was a look of weary, bitter resignation. "Leave it be, Nora," he said, his voice flat. "Wade is a good man. You don't understand how things work here." "I understand theft when I see it," she countered, her voice rising with frustration. "He is robbing you blind, and your uncle is letting it happen." "I said leave it be," he roared, his voice exploding in the small space, the sound of a man pushed too far. He slammed his hammer down on the anvil, the sound of violent, ringing crack that made her flinch. "You are my wife now. You will do as you are told. Stay out of the ranch's business. Stay out of my father's study, and stay away from the old barn. The chapter ends with Nora backing away, not in fear, but in a cold, dawning realization. He was not just a grieving son, he was a man blinded by a misplaced loyalty, or worse, a man who was complicit in his own ruin. She now knew, with an absolute certainty, that she was truly alone in this house of ghosts and lies. If she was going to uncover the truth of what happened 5 years ago, she would have to do it on her own, in secret, and she would have to do it before the men who controlled this ranch realized that she had not come here to be a wife, but to be a judge, a jury, and, if necessary, an executioner. Elias's angry outburst in the smithy did not frighten Nora. It clarified things. His rage was not the righteous anger of a man whose trust had been questioned, but the desperate, cornered anger of a man who was terrified of the truth. It was the reaction of a man who, on some deep subconscious level, already knew he was living in a house built on a foundation of lies but could not bear the thought of looking too closely at the cracks. From that moment on, Nora knew she was not just fighting for her father's honor. She was fighting for the soul of the man she was now bound to, a man who had chosen blindness over the pain of sight. She retreated into a quiet, watchful obedience, a strategic withdrawal. To the outside world, and to Elias and Cyrus, she became the dutiful, silent wife, her days filled with the mundane tasks of running the household. But her nights became a secret, dangerous crusade. Long after the house had fallen still, after the heavy, snoring breaths of Cyrus echoed from the master bedroom and the troubled, restless muttering from Elias's room faded into silence, Nora would slip from her bed. Lit by a single, carefully shielded candle, she would return to the one place on the ranch that held the truth, her late father-in-law's study. The room became her sanctuary and her battlefield. Night after night, she painstakingly went through the old ranch ledgers, the geological surveys, the private journals, her sharp, intelligent mind sifting through years of dust and deception. She found what she was looking for in the subtle, almost invisible discrepancies. A bill of sale for 100 head of prime cattle, with a corresponding payment in the ledger that was inexplicably low. A survey map detailing a rich vein of silver ore on the western ridge of their property. A map that was mysteriously absent from the official county records. And the most damning clue of all, a series of coded messages in her father-in-law's journal, entries made in the weeks before the fire. They spoke of a growing fear of his own brother Cyrus and of a hidden asset that Cyrus was desperate to control. The journal entries ended abruptly, the day before the fire. During the day, Elias Vance played the role of the benevolent, concerned patriarch to perfection. He would often find Nora in the garden or the kitchen, his expression a mask of gentle sympathy. "My dear," he would say, his voice smooth as honey, "you must not dwell on the past. The fire was a terrible tragedy, a wound that will never truly heal for any of us. My brother, he was a good man but a troubled one. We must honor his memory by looking forward, not back." He would praise the foreman, Wade McKinley, in her presence, calling him the loyal backbone of this ranch, the one man who had kept it from collapsing entirely after the tragedy. Every word was a carefully crafted piece of misdirection, a gentle paternal warning to stop digging. But his constant, subtle attempts to steer her away from the past only served to deepen her suspicions, to confirm that she was on the right path. Elias, for his part, was trapped in a miserable, self-imposed purgatory. He treated Nora with a cold, formal distance, a man trying to enforce a boundary that his own heart was beginning to betray. He was a man at war with himself. The years of ingrained trust in his uncle and in Wade, the man who had taught him how to ride and rope, fought a losing battle against the undeniable, logical evidence that Nora had presented. He started to watch, not with the open suspicion of an investigator, but with the quiet, sidelong glances of a man who is beginning to fear that his entire world is a lie. He began to notice the small things, the way Wade would avoid his eyes when discussing the cattle count, the new expensive boots the foreman was wearing, a luxury no simple ranch hand could afford, the hushed conspiratorial conversations between Wade and Cyrus that would abruptly stop the moment he entered a room. Each observation was another small crack in the thick wall of his denial. The breaking point, the moment the first crack became an irreparable fissure, came on a cold, windswept afternoon a month after their wedding. Elias had ridden to a remote corner of the ranch to check on a fence line that Wade had reported as badly damaged by rockfall. But when he arrived, he found the fence perfectly intact. As he sat on his horse, a cold, sinking feeling in his gut, he saw them. A small herd of about 20 of his own prize-winning bulls being driven down a hidden, unused trail by two of Wade's most loyal hands. The trail did not lead to the north pasture. It led directly to the railhead in the next county. When Elias returned to the ranch that evening, the lie he had been living had become too heavy to carry. He found Nora in the study, a single candle burning, the ledgers spread out before her as always. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the gun cabinet, took out a loaded revolver, and placed it on the desk in front of her. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice a low, hard growl, "we find out the truth." The confrontation happened not in the study, but in the barn, the next morning. Nora, armed with her detailed notes, and Elias, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury, confronted Wade McKinley. The foreman, cornered and with no Cyrus there to protect him, tried to bluff his way out. He blustered, he threatened, he denied everything. "These are lies," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Nora. "Lies from a bitter woman trying to ruin a good man's name. You going to believe her, Elias? The daughter of the drunk who killed your own father?" "My father-in-law was a better man than you will ever be, Wade," Nora replied, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "And I have the proof." She held up the small, hidden journal she had started, a detailed, meticulous record of every lie, every stolen head of cattle, every secret meeting she had observed over the past month. As Wade stared at the undeniable proof of his treachery, his bravado crumbled, replaced by a desperate, animalistic fear. He lunged for her, his hands reaching for her throat. "You interfering witch!" But Elias was ready. He stepped between them, his movement a blur of pent-up rage and protective instinct. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Elias, a man who had not raised his hand in anger in 5 years, fought with the ferocity of a man defending the last precious thing in his world. He did not kill Wade, but he left him a broken, bleeding mess on the dirt floor of the barn. After Wade was dealt with, after he had confessed everything in a blubbering, pathetic torrent of self-pity, Elias and Nora finally had their first real conversation. The walls of secrets and suspicion that had stood between them had been torn down by the violent truth. "I am sorry, Nora," Elias said, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I was a fool. I was a coward. I chose to believe a comfortable lie over a hard truth." "You were grieving," she replied, her own voice softening. "And you were loyal. Those are not sins." She then revealed her true, full purpose for agreeing to this strange, cold marriage. "I didn't just come here to work, Elias. I came here to clear my father's name. I know he didn't start that fire. Someone else did, and I believe the proof is somewhere on this ranch." He looked at her, at the fierce, unwavering determination in her eyes, and he finally understood. "I had my doubts too," he confessed quietly. "Things that never made sense. The way the fire spread so fast, the fact that the door to the tack room, their only escape route, was barred from the outside. They were no longer adversaries, no longer a resentful rancher and his suspicious bride. They were partners, united by a shared history of loss and a burning common desire for justice. The ashes of their father's vow had just reignited, and this time, the fire would not be a destructive one. It would be a fire of truth, a fire that would either cleanse the Vance ranch of its secrets or burn it to the ground for good. The confession of the foreman, Wade McKinley, was not an end, but a beginning. It was the first crucial thread pulled from a tapestry of lies that had been woven for 5 long years. Working together now, their shared purpose, a powerful, binding force, Elias and Nora spent the next days piecing together the full, monstrous scope of the conspiracy. They returned to the dusty, forgotten ledgers in the study, but this time they looked at them not as separate histories of 2 different families, but as a single intertwined narrative of betrayal. The hidden asset mentioned in Elias's father's journal was the key. Cross-referencing it with Nora's father's geological surveys, they finally understood. The fire had not been about the ranch itself, not just about the land or the cattle. It had been about what lay beneath it, a rich, untapped vein of silver ore, a deposit so significant it could change the fortunes of the entire territory, was located directly under the site of the old barn. Its existence was a secret known only to their fathers, and now, to them, the motive was finally, chillingly clear. The fire had not been an accident. It had been a calculated, brutal act of murder and theft, designed to silence the two men who held the secret, and to clear the way for the man who wanted it all. And the finger of accusation, cold and undeniable, pointed directly at the only other person who could have possibly known, the one man who had benefited most from the tragedy, their uncle, Cyrus Vance. They knew they couldn't just accuse a man as respected and as powerful as Cyrus. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose benevolence was a carefully constructed facade. They needed more than just old ledgers and a desperate foreman's confession. They needed to trap him. They needed him to expose himself. Their plan was a dangerous one, a high-stakes gamble that used Cyrus's own insatiable greed as the bait. They began to spread a carefully crafted rumor, a whisper that started with a chance remark to Doc Miller, who they now knew was a trustworthy ally, and was then allowed to spread through the town's gossip network like wildfire. The rumor was simple. Elias and his new, surprisingly sharp-witted wife had found the old map their fathers had left behind, a map that detailed the full extent of the silver lode, and they were planning to sell the mining rights to a wealthy syndicate from Denver. The bait, as they had predicted, was too tempting for the wolf to resist. Cyrus, driven by a mixture of greed and a growing panic that his long-held secret was about to be exposed, fell for the trap completely. He confronted them 3 days later, not in the civilized confines of the main house, but at the one place on the ranch that held all their ghosts, the blackened, skeletal ruins of the old barn. He came at dusk, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red, a fitting backdrop for the final act of their long family tragedy. "I hear you've been making plans, nephew," Cyrus said. His voice, usually so full of paternal warmth, was now a low, menacing growl. He was not alone. Behind him, 2 hard-faced men, strangers Elias had never seen before, stood with their hands resting on their holstered guns. "Just business, Uncle," Elias replied, his own voice calm and steady. He and Nora stood together in front of the ruins, a united front. "We're just trying to reclaim what is rightfully ours." "What is yours?" Cyrus laughed, a short, ugly, humorless sound. "Nothing here is yours. It's all mine. I built this ranch back from the ashes your foolish father left behind." "My father wasn't a fool," Elias said, his voice dropping. "And he wasn't a drunk. But you knew that, didn't you?" Cyrus's face in the dying light seemed to collapse, the mask of benevolence finally falling away to reveal the raw, naked ambition and cruelty beneath. "He was weak," he spat, his voice dripping with years of pent-up resentment. "He and that book-smart partner of his, they had a fortune under their feet and they wanted to survey it properly, file the claims legally. They were going to let the government and the railroad take the lion's share. I, on the other hand, saw what it was truly worth." He confessed everything then, gloating in his own cleverness, his arrogance blinding him to the trap that was closing around him. He told them how he had loosened a lantern in the barn, how he had accidentally started the fire during a heated argument, and how he had barred the tack room door from the outside, ensuring his brother and his partner had no escape. It was a tragedy, he finished, a sick, triumphant smile on his face, but a profitable one. And now, he gestured to his 2 hired guns, "It's time to finally clean up the last of the loose ends. Give me the map." But as his men drew their weapons, a new voice, a voice of quiet, weary authority, cut through the tense twilight air. "I don't think so, Cyrus." Sheriff Brody stepped out from the shadows of the nearby woods, not alone, but flanked by a half-dozen deputized ranchers, their own rifles held steady. He had been a man living in the shadow of his own compromises for too long. But the undeniable evidence Elias and Nora had presented to him, combined with his own long-held suspicions, had finally given him the courage to act, to be the lawman he was always supposed to be. The standoff was brief. Cyrus, trapped and exposed, a villain in his own story, was arrested. The truth, after 5 long years, was finally revealed to the world. Their fathers' names, once stained with the shame of incompetence and drunkenness, were cleared, their honor restored. The story ends a year later. The Vance Ranch is thriving. With the silver mine now being legally and profitably operated, the debts are gone and the land is secure. But the true transformation is not in the ranch's finances, but in its heart. Elias and Nora stand together in front of a newly and beautifully rebuilt barn. He is no longer the bitter, haunted man she married. The anger in his eyes has been replaced by a quiet, steady peace. And she is no longer the outcast, the daughter of a supposed criminal. She is the respected, intelligent, and strong co-owner of the most prosperous ranch in the valley. He looks at her, not with the resentment of that first day, but with a profound and overwhelming sense of respect, admiration, and a love that has grown, quietly but undeniably, from the ashes of their shared past. "This marriage," he says, his voice full of an emotion he no longer tries to hide, "started in the ashes of our father's vow to each other, a vow of partnership." He takes her hand, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. "Maybe it's time we made one of our own." The story ends not with another wedding, not with a formal ceremony, but with a quiet, powerful promise made between two partners, two survivors, in the golden light of a setting sun. They have a new vow to fulfill, not just to run a ranch, but to rebuild a shared legacy of honor, truth, and a love that proved to be stronger than fire itself. The Ashes of a Vow is a powerful story that reminds us that we are often haunted not by the tragedies of our past, but by the false narratives we build around them. Elias lived for years in a prison of shame, defined by the belief that his father was a failure and a drunk. This narrative, fed by the lies of a manipulative uncle, colored his entire worldview, turning him into a bitter and isolated man. He wasn't just grieving a death, he was grieving a legacy of dishonor. His journey is a profound lesson in the importance of questioning the stories we are told, especially the ones that define our own families and our own sense of self. Nora, similarly, was a prisoner of a public lie. She was ostracized as the daughter of a criminal, a label that followed her and shaped her life. Yet deep down, she held on to a powerful, unwavering faith in her father's integrity. Her quest was not just for vengeance, but for the truth. She was unwilling to let the world's false verdict be the final word on her family's honor. She teaches us that while we cannot always control the circumstances of our lives, we have a profound power in choosing which truths we are willing to fight for. The heart of their story lies in their reluctant partnership. They were two people who were supposed to be enemies, bound by a shared history of shame and blame. Yet, it was only when they had the courage to look past the official story and trust their own instincts that they began to find their way to the truth. Their alliance is a testament to the idea that our true allies are not always the people society tells us to trust, but the ones who are willing to stand with us in the uncomfortable, often dangerous, pursuit of what is right. Ultimately, The Ashes of a Vow is a story about the power of rewriting your own history. Elias and Nora couldn't change the fact that their fathers were murdered. They couldn't erase the fire or the years of pain and lies that followed. But by unearthing the truth, they were able to reclaim their father's honor, and in doing so, reclaim their own futures. They rebuilt the barn not just as a physical structure, but as a symbol of their new shared legacy, one built not on the ashes of a lie, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of the truth. It's a powerful reminder that it is never too late to set the record straight, and that the most important vow we can make is the vow to live an honest life. And so, from the ashes of a terrible lie, a haunted rancher and a defiant daughter discovered that the truth, once unearthed, has the power to not only clear the names of the dead, but to give new life to the living. They didn't just rebuild a barn, they rebuilt a legacy of honor. Thank you for digging into this powerful mystery with us here at Wild West Secrets. If this story of family secrets, betrayal, and the long, hard fight for the truth resonated with you, then you have found your home with us. We are dedicated to telling the complex, character-driven stories that lie buried beneath the surface of the American frontier. To help us continue to unearth these tales, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who believes that the truth is always worth fighting for. And if you never want to miss another secret we uncover, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Now, we present the evidence to you. Leave a comment below and tell us, what do you think was the more powerful force in this story? Cyrus's greed, or Elias and Nora's need for the truth? Until our next story, may you have the courage to question the stories you've been told, and may you always fight for the honor of those you love. Stay safe out on the trail.